Здравейте, драги зрители! It's an absolute delight to be back with you, especially after kicking Nurgle out, for the nasty cold the fat cretin hit me with. Hopefully none of you have also had to suffer similar indignity recently. But if you happen to be under assault by the Stinky Legions, hold strong and keep pushing back. Burn away the heresy in your bodies. The Emperor believes in you. Now, some of you might be wondering, where's the Zerg video? Please allow me a minute or so for a small bit of shilling first. Worry not, it is complete and will air on YouTube in the next 3 days. However, if you would like to see it earlier, you can do so by supporting the channel on Ko-fi or Patreon. Other than the general video making, I want to expand into other mediums like music, animation, and art. But as someone that can barely assemble and paint miniatures half decently, I will need help in those fields. They are where any potential support you are willing to extend will be invested in. In that regard, since just empty promises are not something worthwhile, depending on the tier you would be comfortable with contributing, you will also be able to access all of the custom artwork and any other commissioned media already made and that will be made for the channel's projects, as well as have your name featured as thanks in future videos, like the channel's first monthly supporter, A1Sicrex1. Of course, it goes without saying, only do so if you're in a position to do so. Yourself, your family and loved ones come first and far above some weird rat on the internet. In the case that you're both able and deem the endeavor deserving of your additional support, you will have my deepest gratitude for it. Now then, with the self-promotion done, let's get back on track. Before the arrival of the bugs and their betters, I reckon it would be prudent to touch on a couple of things core to their origins and function, which did not really factor with the Terrans that much, hence their lack in the previous overview. Originally, this whole thing got written in the Zerg video, but it messed with the flow of things, so instead I took it out as its own separate bonus piece of content. Thus, let's dive into it by taking a look at StarCraft's sort-of equivalent to Warhammer 40K's warp, the Void. Similarities here are, thankfully, brief. Another metaphysical dimension that exists alongside reality, but separate from it, where thought, energy, and existence overlap. Quick note, the Void has no relation to the warp dimension used for FTL travel in StarCraft. The first, and quite major difference between the two, however, is that they are kind of in reverse. Where in 40K, the warp is a reflection of the conscious and subconscious roiling sum of the living things in the material universe, thus stemming from it, the Void was very likely responsible for life in the material universe of StarCraft. It has not been stated to be the first thing that manifested, but the Void is more fundamental to existence than the physical plane in that setting, as, from what we know and suspect in universe, its own tumult is the source layer of consciousness, energy, and form, as well as being the origin point for how Psionics came to be. It is here that the Xel'Naga, the creator race of the setting, predominantly known as peaceful, benevolent, and utterly consumed with studying and propagating sentient evolution within the universe, enter the stage. Normally, the energies of the Void are entropic, destabilizing, and damaging. Not inherently corruptive like the warp, but destructive. When coming into contact with matter, they unmake it on a subatomic level, while contact with other forms of energy causes their flow to be disrupted, broken, and ultimately snuffed out. Only psionics and psionic-adjacent things like artifacts or substances can, in essence, bridge the gap between this dimension and real space in order to interact with it. And, due to the nature of said energy I just described, in order to make use of the Void's vast power, a psionic must have sufficient power of their own, as well as mastery of control, combined with the most important ingredient, unshakable will, to tap into this mighty dark wellspring without getting destroyed by it, and then to be able to focus and shape it to their design. A brief reminder from the Terran video, Psionics are the StarCraft equivalent to Psykers and their abilities. While both have the same variety of powers, ranging from simple things like moving objects around and reading/influencing the minds of others, to seeing the future, metamorphing reality, or just casting various flavors of fireball, the space magic of Psionics is inherent to them in their very own DNA. Unlike Psykers, whose power is really them tapping into the warp and using its Empyrean waters to manifest what they're capable of, Psionics can just do whatever their particular brand of psychojank is without a tertiary component like the warp. It is something they draw directly and only from themselves. However, if they have the power, skill, and necessary will, or cheat by having entire scientific fields min-max particular resource access and intake, Psionics can tap into other sources of, or things infused with, psionic energy to empower and/or augment their own abilities. The Void is simply the biggest and richest source of uber juice, which you can't really cheat with. If you tap into it directly, and you don't have the chops to hold out against it, you just vaporize yourself. Circling back to the Xel'Naga, they originated in the Void. Now, obviously said origins are kept intentionally vague and mysterious, just like those of the old ones from Warhammer, so the following is my best guess of piecing together information and interpreting it in a cohesive fashion as far as I have understood it. From what we can tell, their very first aspects to form in the roiling tumult were their individual consciousnesses, which gradually developed sapience and self-recognition, adapting to the infinite oceans of etheric energy surrounding and suffusing them, learning to tap into, influence, and ultimately master said powers, finally using their refined manipulation of the entropic energies to create rather than destroy, which culminated with their first ever forms, built to house their respective consciousnesses. From this process, I suspect, is how the Xel'Naga became consummate shapeshifters. Once their own power, mastery, and will reached a certain zenith, they began to feel and eventually discovered the material plane. Fascinated with it, the Xel'Naga would open gateways into it and use their psionic abilities in tandem with the sciences they had developed to seed the universe with life, which, in a way, was made in their own image, referring to the ability for psionic potential to develop within and across what said life would eventually bloom into being included in it. Glancing again towards the Void, though, there are some things about it that don't really add up with its presentation thus far. Most puzzling being the existence of enormous land masses and breathable atmosphere within it, since normally such things should not exist in a dimension that annihilates matter and different kinds of energy. From what I've dug out, it's never openly explained how or why these things are present in the Void, but at the risk of appearing too much like the Ancient Aliens guy, I personally speculate that the explanation is pretty obvious and simple. The Xel'Naga did it. Since they are creatures with the ability to bend and morph reality that subjugate the unlimited power dimension with their will, installing a material plane habitat in their living room isn't something beyond them. Though it does raise the question of why, which in of itself can be easily answered with the nature of how the Xel'Naga interact with the material plane and their most sacred work, the Great Cycle. Regarding the former, this is where the creator squids are most similar to the entities that are born from and within 40K's Immaterium. As creatures of the Void, they can't fully manifest within the material plane. To do so, they require some manner of host form or construct capable of containing the vastness of such an entity, which they can inhabit in order to go about in normal space. And, if said host is somehow destroyed, the consciousness and power of the Xel'Naga that inhabited it is thrust back into the Void itself. While they can possess something suitable, or even manufacture such host bodies themselves, before sending them from the Void and into our plane, it takes a lot to build such a complex form, and similar things barely ever occur naturally on their own, to the point where once a suitable host is made, the Xel'Naga would keep it hibernating on their quote-unquote homeworld within real space, Ulnar, which is more akin to a planet-sized space station that can turn into a gateway into the Void itself. So, when interacting with beings from our side of reality, it would realistically be more convenient to have habitable zones in their own yard where to meet them, beyond Ulnar's Chamber of Ascension. A meeting meant to fulfill the aforementioned Great Cycle, the Xel'Naga's way of kind of reproducing, but more accurately rejuvenating their race. While innately longeval, with some among them having lifetimes that spanned in the millions or even billions of years that we can infer from the hint scraps of lore about it, the Xel'Naga are not immortal. Why they can't reproduce amongst themselves, or have new individuals come to be from the void itself like they originally did, we don't know. The only thing we're told is that to propagate their race throughout the aeons, they had discovered/developed the Great Cycle. What that refers to is the predicted emergence of two races on the material plane. One exemplifying purity of form, meaning it has a solid and stable genetic structure that is highly resistant to mutation and degradation, endowed with immense psionic potential capable of possibly housing the essence of a Xel'Naga. The other exemplifying purity of essence, meaning it has a great capacity for change and adaptation, essentially endowed with immense evolutionary potential that can eventually accommodate any environment or internal restructuring. With the idea being that, eventually, over the course of astronomic swaths of time, said races would encounter each other and merge into one, learning of the Xel'Naga and striving to find them, which would eventually result in breaching into the void itself. Once creation and maker encountered each other, the eldest among the Xel'Naga would voluntarily give unto the intertwined race their essence and all of the cosmic power found within it, thus uplifting them into a new generation of Xel'Naga. On top of rejuvenating the population, doing so has an additional benefit that some of you with more modern weeb knowledge may have gotten the thought for, namely that this technically would make the newer generations much stronger, since the power of the Xel'Naga would be getting added to the already extraordinary power, mastery, and will the ascending race would have needed to develop in order to utilize and eventually breach into the void itself, acting like the one-for-all quirk from the My Hero Academia series, just on a cosmic level. At least that is the reigning theory on how and why Kerrigan was able to defeat Amon, the Xel'Naga who orchestrated a civil war that made the species practically extinct, and who was able to dominate the void dimension in its near entirety after she was bestowed with the essence of Oros, the last remaining Xel'Naga, who was clearly weaker than Amon as he was imprisoned by him. Brief side note, while the reason why Kerrigan was able to receive the essence of a Xel'Naga without having any protoss DNA in her has not been openly stated, since the setting was practically building up how the protoss and zerg would need to merge in order to ascend, it is widely estimated that she managed to fulfill the criteria of the cycle on her own. As a human, she was born with an exceptional psionic potential, around which the Psi rating scale was practically built. Yes, she's the benchmark around which the exponential scaling StarCraft version of the Warhammer 40K Psyker rating scale used by the Terrans is built. When she was originally infested, her already impressive psionic abilities went up a lot, which was retained after her de-infestation, leaving her with a lot of psionic power and hyper-focused will. So later on, when she went to the Zerg homeworld of Xeris and imbued herself with primal Zerg essence, she didn't just reinfest herself, but instead became a human primal Zerg hybrid, essentially purity of form and purity of essence merging, which allowed her to take on the power of a full Xel'Naga and pushed her to that ridiculous Alpha Plus scaling that was enough to add to Oros' own power to overcome Amon. Now, this type of essence transfer, one Xel'Naga to one other being, may not be the only way this is done, and instead there might be variations, because I don't know how else to address the issue that is Duran, a servant of Amon, who himself is also a Xel'Naga, but was evidently weaker than primal Kerrigan before her ascension. Another case of no clarification about that. Reasoning on it, the only conclusion I'm able to come up with is that, maybe, at the completion of the Great Cycle, a single Xel'Naga Elder could bestow their power onto multiple individuals of the newly ascending united purity of form and essence, thus resulting in weaker Xel'Naga since the power would be split, but in exchange this is how their species multiplies into greater numbers. I feel like this is an appropriate point where we can touch upon one of the older pieces of lore that has not really been fleshed out in satisfactory fashion in modern times, namely that the Zerg killed the Xel'Naga. When that was first mentioned, the Lifebringers were described more as just super advanced aliens that like to mess with biology, like the initial Old Ones, rather than extra cosmic beings of reality warping power. Later on, that detail was changed to Amon unleashing the Zerg upon the Xel'Naga when they confronted him and his faction of their species, who tried to circumvent the Great Cycle, where it is stated that after devouring them is how the Overmind learned of the protoss. But, as you can very likely consider, even if Amon and Oros were like the extreme top-tier Xel'Naga power-wise, there's bound to have been some close to their level at least. And if the Zerg ate them, how did the bugs not just go Super Saiyan on the whole of existence? Or better yet, how would they have done so when they would also need to go into the Void for that, yet the whole swarm barely knew what the Void dimension is at the time? Since Blizzard is apparently allergic to clear answers, the way I reason this circle is meant to be squared is more so the case that when Amon's faction was confronted by the remaining Xel'Naga in the material plane, the Zerg swarm aided in that initial stage of the war and only helped to destroy the physical host bodies of the various Xel'Naga, from which they got the additional knowledge but no cosmic superpowers. Meanwhile, because their host bodies got destroyed, all of the Xel'Naga on both sides, except evidently Duran, were thrust back into the Void, where the civil war continued and they practically extincted themselves, with the sole exception being Oros, who was somehow entrapped by Amon's lingering power and creations, cause he also died in that conflict until Duran revived his consciousness as per the events of StarCraft 2. One last detail that bears a need for overview, however, might just be the most important when it comes to scaling the Xel'Naga to things in 40k. It is noted that, quote, "The cycle was repeated in numerous universes. At the start of a universe's creation, the Xel'Naga would take on physical form and enter it, seeding it with life. The cycle repeated so many times that time itself was affected by it. Whereupon the ascension of the two destined races into Xel'Naga, the Great Cycle would reset and repeat." Looking at it, this would seem rather straightforward, but there are some inconsistencies regarding that. At an initial reading, one might think that when this new ascended crop happens, the universe resets. Except at the end of StarCraft 2, that did not happen. Everything just continued as normal, at least cosmically, in the material universe. And since the statement of multiple universes is given at face value, it can't also be the case that it's just the one same universe that only began once, and the Xel'Naga have only been doing their thing in it. Realistically, that leaves only two viable ways to look at it. Either the material universe experiences death and rebirth via some Big Bang fashion, and the Xel'Naga simply slumber through it in the Void or Ulnar, the gateway world they created to be able to venture between their home dimension and the physical one, after which they get up and reseeded with life. Or the Void, where they reside, is some kind of central dimension, quote-unquote, that connects a multiverse of material universes between which the Xel'Naga move. In either case, given everything we went over, when you take into account the nature of the Void and its energies, since the Xel'Naga are creatures of and suffused with it, but unlike 40k demons, they have a being and will of their own, through which they dominate the Void, are able to peer into the past and future, can open independent gateways and rifts between their own dimension and real space on their own volition, and have no need for worshippers or anything similar to sustain their abilities, I think it's safe to say that they are, at least on average, more powerful than the artificially created gods in 40k, such as those of the Eldar and Orcs, and by extension are more powerful than the Catan. Very likely not as powerful as the Chaos Gods, since those represent actual fundaments of existence, but in my opinion, if their whole race didn't obliterate itself in their own version of the Horus Heresy, I think collectively the Xel'Naga would have been able to contain, or maybe, possibly even purify them. More importantly, however, how about yourselves? Would you agree with my assessment, or are there any details that sway you otherwise? Please let me know in the comments below. I'll be looking forward to reading them. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to demolish the like button and consider subscribing to keep up with the rest of this and future other series. For those of you who decide to support the channel a little extra, I hope you enjoyed the next video and the cool artwork from across my projects so far. While for the rest of you, dear viewers, I'll see you in 3 days' time, when we get into a proper deep dive of the bugs. Until then, I wish you all a lovely rest of your day. Довиждане!